My clinical experience, I would say, and my life experience taught me that you could divide your life in some sense into thirds. And 1/3 of that is intimate relationship, so we'll say marriage. 1/3 of that is family, and 1/3 of that is career. That's a rough break, a rough categorization, but it's not a bad place to start with regards to rule of thumb. Well, why get married? Well, people want a partner. Half the dialogue that you hear between people, especially if they're single, is related to their desire to have a partner. And of course, half the dialogue you hear from people who are in a relationship is how to deal with problems in their relationship. But it's a very rare person who doesn't need and want an intimate relationship. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what does intimate mean? And the cheap interpretation of intimate is sexual, but that's a pale reflection in some sense of true intimacy, even on the sexual front, because true intimacy means getting to know someone. It's interesting that the biblical term for sexual congress is knowledge. And I think that's because the intimacy that brings about the highest level of sexual fulfillment, all things considered, has to be nested within a much more profound and properly integrated and oriented intimacy. And I think that most fundamentally that's to be found in the state of marriage. People often think about marriage as the death of sex, let's say, but permanent singlehood is also, by the way, the death of sex. And one of the things that we've seen as the sexual revolution has continued apace is that young people are, in some sense, more disturbed in their sexual orientation rather than less, turning to pornography and masturbation, and forswearing intimate relationships entirely, or forswearing sexual interaction of all sorts, even self-administered entirely. And that doesn't seem to be a plus. So you enter into marriage as an act of faith. You fall in love with someone, which is a grace, a gift of God in some real sense. You see what it would be like to care for someone. You see what it would be like to have someone care for you and value you. You get a glimpse of that in love. And then you have a challenge set before you, which is, can you arrange your life with this person that you've fallen in love with so that that state of love permeates the entire relationship and everything you do together all the time? And so that would make a marriage the perfect date that repeats endlessly. Now, obviously, that's an extraordinarily high goal to hit, a high mountain to climb, but you need something to do, and it might as well be that. And in an intimate relationship, when things are going as well as they can go, I think you're hard-pressed to find anything better in life. So why not attempt to achieve that? Well, why do you need marriage? Well, you need marriage just like you need other social institutions. Marriage is a great burden and responsibility, as well as a great opportunity. It's a burden and responsibility because as a married couple, you're going to face together everything that life can throw at you. And so the difference between a casual affair, let's say, and a marriage is that the casual affair is all milk and honey, let's say. It's all pleasure, although it very rarely works out that way, but that's the theory. Whereas in the marriage, you have to contend with the harsh realities of all the dimensions of life. But you want to take that on voluntarily, and you want to share that with someone. And if you do that properly within the confines of a marriage, then you have someone to weave together the rope of the narrative of your life. And you have someone to bounce yourself off, and you have someone to improve yourself in relationship with, and you have someone that you have to take into consideration, like you should take yourself into consideration, and you have someone that you have to take into consideration over the longest possible span of time. And what that means is that you're forced, in a real sense, to perform the kind of sacrifice of impulsive hedonism that produces a true maturity. So let's say, imagine that you're only out for yourself. And maybe you are willing to use other people instrumentally, sexually, and your motivation is hedonism and pleasure come what may. It's like, okay, let's think about that. Well, what do you mean by pleasure? Do you mean pleasure in the next 30 seconds? Do you mean pleasure in the next 3 minutes? Do you mean pleasure tonight? And I'm asking because you might say, well, why not cocaine and hookers as a non-stop diet? And the answer to that seems to be something like, well, it might be good for 3 minutes or one evening, but the hangover the next day isn't to be desired, and that gets worse the more you walk down that hedonic route. And then there's the call of conscience that comes a knocking at 3 a.m. when you're hungover and dissolute after your idiot promiscuous rampage. It's a bad medium to long-term strategy. So when we're talking about hedonism, we have to specify exactly what we mean. Are you doing what makes you happy in an impulsive way? Or are you doing what's best for you in the multiplicity of your iterations across the broadest span of decades? And then we would say, well, if you're acting properly in relationship to you and all of your future selves, then you're sacrificing the idiot impulsive hedonism of the present to a medium to long-term strategy that's preferable in all regards. And I would say that's part of developing an adult vision. And then you might say, well, I want to be free to pursue my hedonic demands, desires, whenever I want to, under what conditions, whatever conditions prevail. And I would first say, well, do you really think that's possible? Like, how is that going to work? Second, aren't you just going to use other people for your own pleasure? Third, aren't you just going to use yourself for your own short-term and counterproductive pleasure? Fourth, how is that different from being a 2-year-old? There's nothing in that that's a mature vision. And so you could imagine, and this is a technical argument, that the nature of moral behavior is constrained by the fact of your repetition across the hours and days and weeks and months and years of your life. You have to act in relationship to yourself like you're a totality stretched across time. And so that means that, and this is why conscience bothers you if you betray yourself, is because your conscience is an indicator of behavior in relationship to the medium in the long run. Now, that means you have to treat yourself like you're a community that extends across time. And one way of learning how to do that, that's very profound, is to shackle yourself to another person, say within the confines of a marriage, because then you know that, well, you're going to be with that person for the minutes and hours and days and weeks and years of your life. And so you have to treat them in a manner that's reciprocal and productive, that grows positively over decades. And then you can imagine that there's a complex optimization problem that emerges out of that, which is, well, how do you treat someone in your moment-to-moment interactions so that the relationship blossoms into, well, let's say, continual love? And that's a good thing to aim at. And there's no difference between doing that and treating yourself properly. They're the same thing. And then you can imagine if you treated yourself properly and your partner properly, and you really learned how to do that. This is a deep problem. It's a deep problem, and you have to be challenged to do it constantly. If you did that properly, first of all, there'd be nothing better that could possibly happen to you. And second, you'd have the perfect platform for having children. Because now the children come into the world, and there's two of you, and you're side by side, and you're treating each other like you're extensions of each other, which you are, because you're stuck with this person forever. And then the child has the amalgam, the joint amalgam of two personalities that have had to bargain and negotiate to produce a unity, and the child's introduced into the fact of that unity, which is the higher order structure that governs the marriage. So that's Christ himself in the Christian marriage tradition, let's say. Or you could think of it as the law and the prophets in the Jewish tradition. It boils down in some sense to the same thing. Now the child enters a world where a negotiated solution between two mature partners has been established, and his or her behavior can be calibrated in relationship to that joint union. And that union is wiser than either of the two individuals would have been on their own. Wiser because the medium to long-term reality of mature life has been factored into account, but also wiser because the voluntary and forced union of the two personalities in the marriage produces a meta-personality that's a much better representation of the ideal mature adult toward which the child should orient his or her developmental strivings. And so now with a child, you're looking at a relationship that's going to last, in all likelihood, the entire course of your life, certainly as a dependent for at least 18 years and probably longer than that. And so the necessity of getting this right in the medium to long term is self-evident. You might ask yourself, well, why have children? Well, let's look at the objections first. The planet has too many people on it. It's like, no, we're not accepting that argument. First of all, as population has increased over the last 40 years dramatically, people have got much, much richer. Not just a little bit, but a lot. And so what that indicates absolutely clearly is that more people produce more wealth, not less. And then you might say, well, wealth destroys the planet. And I would say, you think wealth destroys the planet? Try and force poverty to see what destroys the planet. And all the data that I've been able to accumulate indicates that the fastest way forward to a sustainable future is to ameliorate absolute poverty at the lowest level of the hierarchy of economic security and opportunity. Period. And then the economists have been fighting with the biologists, the Malthusian biologists, for 50 years about whether human ingenuity can remove us from a landscape of privation and want and Malthusian population explosion disaster. And the economists have won the argument every single time it was clearly formulated and clearly put forth as a proposition by the Malthusian biologists. Because it seems to be the case that the human imagination, untrammeled and oriented properly, can continually make more out of less. And if you don't believe that, then just think a little bit about computational capacity and the fact that every year and a half, our computational capacity doubles with the utilization of less and less resources. So the notion that we're born into a landscape of inevitable scarcity, wrong. And it's not just wrong, it's deeply anti-human, and sometimes it's so deeply anti-human that it borders on the demonic and genocidal. And you might say that's an overstatement. Goethe, Faust, Mephistopheles, the figure of Lucifer or Satan. What's Mephistopheles' credo in Faust? Life is so bitter and so full of betrayal and malevolence that it would be better if nothing existed at all. That's the Mephistophelian creed. And that's a very deep argument, and there isn't any argument that's more wrong. So in the opening scenes of Genesis, when God creates the world, when order extracts the world out of chaos, God states repeatedly, and it was good. And so the idea is that the reality that emerges out of the truthful and loving confrontation with chaotic possibility is good if it's incarnated properly. And that's part of the challenge in a marriage, is how to set the marriage up so that the joint personality, which is an analog of Christ or the Word in the Christian tradition, faces the potential of the future and structures it so that it's good. And then you bring children into that, and that's good too. Okay, then you might say, well, what about the responsibility of children? It's like, well, first of all, what do you want? You don't want responsibility? What do you want instead? You want nothing? You want nihilism? You want cynicism? You want immaturity? You want dependence? You want this narrow hedonism that sacrifices even yourself to the demands of the moment? We could say something else about that too. You might say, well, I want to be free to pursue what I want to pursue. It's like, what you want to pursue, eh? Who's the you we're talking about here? So you're satisfying your lust, you're satisfying your gluttony, you're satisfying your envy, you're satisfying your rage, you're satisfying your sense of victimization. What makes you think that those aren't gods that are ruling you? You think that's you and your freedom? To be as impulsive hedonically as you want? Why aren't you just in the grip of a lesser devil? Because that's exactly what it looks like to me, and it certainly plays out that way in people's lives. That short-term impulsive hedonism, which is the lack of the sacrificial mentality, that produces nothing but chaotic disaster, anxiety, misery, a decrement in happiness overall. Certainly no noble pursuit, no adventure, nothing but a pathetic, cringing, oldest frat boy at the party nihilism by the age of 40. There is nothing good about that. And so you take on the responsibility of a marriage. Voluntarily, as an adventure, you take on the responsibility of children. It's good to bring children into the world. It's proper to bring them into a well-constituted marriage. And then you might say, well, what's on the upside? Is it all burden and responsibility? And the answer to that is, well, you have people around you that you love, hypothetically, your family members, and you're pretty happy that you have a family, so you're not completely alone. And I know sometimes people have miserable, disjointed, horrible families, but usually even in those situations when a mother or father dies, the children grieve. So there's even value to be found there. It's like you got a family. It's like, you could expand that family. You could have kids, and then all of a sudden you'd have more people who are just as important to you as the most important people in your life has ever been. Now, why is that a problem? And then there's more. That child wants more than anything else to have the best possible relationship with you that anyone ever had with anyone. That's what they want. And you could have that with the child if you got your act together. And so then you could be surrounded by people who have the best relationship with you that there could possibly be. And that could last for the rest of your life. It's like, where's the problem here? And then you think, well, kids, they interfere with what do they interfere with exactly? Like cocaine-fueled binge parties? Yeah, they interfere with that. And maybe that's good because then you won't die stupidly face down in a ditch. And I can say that with some authority because I had clients who died exactly that way. And I wouldn't recommend it, precisely. And children, they reward you like mad, as long as you put down a minimum of rules and you have some order in the household and some predictability so that they don't get hot or cold or wet or tired or hungry. That's about the whole limit of child catastrophe. So if you can get that under control, you've pretty much got it. They're so much fun to be around that why would you do anything else? As a woman, well, you have the opportunity for a lot of cuddling and intimate love, and women, good mothers, are really good at that, especially with infants. They're very good at seeing the nascent person and establishing a relationship very early on. But once the child's old enough to engage in a little bit of play, rough and tumble play, which is more on the male side, then that's just a continual blast. And I mean, part of what you end up doing with kids, which is kind of sad, is they're so much fun that half the time what you do is discipline them because they're having too much fun. Because they're noisy and boisterous and running around the place. And that can just get to be too much. You have to put a limit on that impulsive play as well. And then kids play all the time. If you can establish the conditions for that, which is an indication that you have your household set up right, because then the children will play. And there isn't any higher form of activity than play. And so if your household is set up properly, then you can all play. And that's the best thing you can possibly do. So I just don't see that as a particular problem too. And then you might think, well, I have to establish a secure basis for them and I have to be a reliable provider. And it's like, yeah, okay, you got something better to do? And you're going to have a career or a job and you need to be maximally motivated to do that properly because otherwise you're going to be a scoundrel at half-wit and you're going to laze around and be useless. And some of that's got to come from demand. Some of it should be, well, I want to be a good plumber, or I want to be a good electrician. There's some hope in it. But some of it should also be, hey, I got people depending on me, and I better grow up and do a good job because otherwise there's going to be some unnecessary suffering of the innocents. And so what? You have kids, now you have to grow up and somehow know now you're not Peter Pan, and that's supposed to be a problem? I don't see that as a problem. I see that as an opportunity. And then you might say, well, you marry the same old person. It's like, if you're bored by someone, okay, that's you. That's you. You're caught in the prisons of your own presumptions and you're overlaying something on people and it's some it's some dead and sterile apprehension you have about the nature of humanity, and you're just running into that over and over. And you think, oh, people are so boring. It's like, nope, that's you. If it's people, it's you. It's just like, if women are a problem and you're a man, that's you. If men are a problem and you're a woman, that's you. And if you're bored by people, that's you. And so now you're bored by your partner. It's like, are you bored by your partner, or what? Are you bored by what you forced them to become? Or are you bored by your lack of creative imagination on the erotic and intimate front? Are you bored by the fact that you've turned your house into a sterile, fear-ridden prison? It's like, just who's boring here? And then the next issue is, well, what makes you think that someone isn't an infinite mystery? It's like, you are. Have you tried getting yourself under control? That's real difficult. You're full of snakes and surprises. You don't think your partner's exactly the same way? And of course, there's a downside to that because you run into weird impediments as you move forward together. But there's this infinite wellspring of mystery. And I would say, when you fall in love with someone, which is generally the precondition for marriage, when you fall in love with someone, you see that infinite wellspring of mystery. It's granted to you as a gift, and then if you have any sense and you're willing to devote yourself to it in no small manner, then you can foster that infinite wellspring to continually pour forth, and you'll find that that one person you're with is way more interesting than any plethora of short-term shallow relationships that you could possibly imagine. And I do not believe that there are people who don't know that. We all know that. We know it. And we might come up with a very large number of rationalizations for why we don't need to take responsibility and why short-term, hedonic, pleasure-centered one-night stands are just the thing. But I don't see any of that credible in the least. And I would also like to point out on the promiscuity front that that also presents a non-trivial and constant public health danger. And we just about took ourselves out with AIDS, and everybody shorted out about that for about 15 years. And it doesn't look to me like we've got any smarter in the interim. Now, and then you might say, well, who needs marriage? It's just a piece of paper. We'll just live together and our love can carry us through. It's like, really, you're so good at loving, are you? You're that good that that'll just carry you through. You don't need to stand up in front of your whole community and bind yourself in commitment and to the other person and to make that public, and to make it formal, and to ally yourselves with the monogamous traditions of the past. You're above all that, are you? It's just a piece of paper. That's your argument. And so, no, because to be bound together in marriage is a very difficult thing. There are many forces that will pull you apart, and your family and your friends and your community need to know that you're dead serious about this, and you need to know that they're on board for the game. The in-laws and the extended friendship networks of both couples have to be brought into this as part of the broader community that supports the married couple. And so if you can't sacralize that with one-day ceremony, then you have to ask yourself, just how committed are you to this other person or to yourself? It's so shallow. And men do this to women a lot, because my experience has been women are generally, if they're living with someone, are much more unhappy about the fact that it's merely, or more overtly unhappy, that it's merely a short-term arrangement. And then we could go into that. Well, you should try someone out before you live with them. Really, like a used car, that's what you should do. You take them for a test drive and see if you're compatible. And you could say, well, yeah, that's the sensible thing to do. It's like, okay, let's look at the data. Do couples who live together before they're married get divorced more or less than couples who just get married? And the answer is, they get divorced more. And so, it doesn't work. Why? Well, let's delve into the philosophy of living together. It's like, okay, we've been going out for a while.